Hello, this is Falterfire, and today I am doing a tier list ranking of all of the trinkets in Breach Wanderers. And so I will have a link in the description that will go to the wiki page for all of the trinkets so that you can read them in case you're not very familiar with the game. I will try to mention what they do as I go over them, but if you want to follow along and you either have difficulty following my explanations or you just are the sort of person who likes to be able to refer to text, I will have that link in the description for you. The trinkets here, I am only looking at the ones that are in the normal pool of trinkets. There are a handful that are available through events as special things, and I'm not going to be including those because you won't be seeing them in most runs, and when you do see them, they will not appear as choices against the other trinkets. The one exception to that is the Pure Coast Crystal, which right now can appear either as a normal trinket that you get after you receive 100 item energy and you're doing that normal choice, or it can also appear from a depth 3 event. So why trinkets? I did consider doing some of the other item types. There are accessories and there are weapons and there are outfits, but those tend to be fairly straightforward. You kind of already know if you want a given outfit or weapon. You know, does this weapon do strike damage? Well, do you have strikes? If you have strikes, you want the weapon that does strike damage. There are some ones that stand out as being particularly unique, but generally I think with outfits and with accessories and with weapons, it's pretty straightforward whether or not you want a specific one. And also you won't see the majority of them in any given run. Whereas with trinkets, if you have the full forge upgrade so that you're seeing 3 items every time you're presented with an item choice and you're playing depth 3, so you're going through quite a few fights, you'll end up seeing a lot of these trinkets in any given run. And so you will often have to make choices between them. You'll often multiple times end up having to either choose between them directly on the item selection or indirectly where you're offered one, then you have to decide which of the trinkets you already have you least like. So I figured this made sense to go through. So my tiers, I have Incredible. So Incredible is any trinket where you see it, and then unless there is another trinket that is also in the Incredible tier, you're taking that trinket when you see it, just straight up. And it will almost always, if not win fights outright, it will have a significant impact on improving your fights, improving your turns, improving your chance of winning. And you will notice when you have it. Great are trinkets that tend to be very useful, but either they are slightly more conditional, they have some caveat that means I wouldn't necessarily put them in the Incredible tier, or they are just solid baseline but aren't likely to really outperform. Good trinkets are a step below that. They are the ones where you will just kind of take them because you need to fill spots and they will do okay work, but you'll probably end up replacing them eventually. Mediocre trinkets are the trinkets that you take basically just because the other 2 items offered were for slots that were already full and you just figured it was better to have anything than just the 20 item energy, so you just took them. Mediocre trinkets are trinkets you're never really ever happy to have, but sometimes you'll take them anyway. Niche trinkets are trinkets that are good in very specific scenarios, and outside of those scenarios, they're probably at mediocre or lower. I'll talk a bit about them as I go over items that are in the niche category. So the first one here is Ancient Statue, which is after each time you kill something, you get powerful +1. I'd put this honestly in mediocre. The problem that it has is it is rare that you will be getting that much powerful from it during a fight, and usually once you've hit the point in a fight where you've started killing things, the extra powerful doesn't matter that much. And so a lot of times if you are doing strikes especially, You need a lot of extra damage for the first enemy because the first enemy is often the tankier of them. You're looking at fights like the Natha in Area 2. If there's a Natha at the front or there's a rock golem at the front, you probably want powerful to deal with it, and it's less useful later. So I don't tend to think Ancient Statue is that great. Mediocre is maybe being a bit mean. It's fine, but I just have never been the happiest to have Ancient Statue. Arcane Amulet. Arcane Amulet says max arcane +8, which means that if you have this, it will take more time before you suffer an arcane detonation. This goes in niche, because one of the things with all of the amulets is that in Area 3, they don't do anything for you. So, not on their own anyway. And in Area 2, they are only, the Arcane Amulet in particular is only useful in 2 fights, the Arcane Wisp fight, and then I suppose against the 3 fights, if you include the mid-boss. Because it's the Arcane Wisp fight, and then 2 of the 3 mid-bosses can do Arcane. The Elemental Amalgamation and the Treants will both do Arcane to you, so it can be useful there. And then the Arcane Elemental fight. But so, it's only useful in those fights, and how useful it is varies a lot depending on whether or not you already have tools to deal with those. So the main reason that I would take Arcane Amulet is if you have Mystic Ritual, which is the card that Arcane Wisps drop that lets you draw cards and applies Arcane to yourself. And if you have an Arcane Amulet, then you can play that twice without worrying about the Arcane Decay before you will actually get an Arcane proc on yourself, which is quite useful. But even then, it's pretty marginal. I wouldn't go out of my way to pick it up, but if you happen to have it, it's a neat little interaction. Aura of Protection. I'd put this one in Incredible. It is a little bit conditional. You do have to be playing a deck that it cares about using shield. But having Aura of Protection means that you can completely avoid, for the most part, taking other shielding cards, because spending 2 mana to get 10 shield in a lot of cases. So either you already are in a defensive strategy, like if you're playing Tank Salon or Tank Enna, where you're getting a lot of sturdy, and then you're trying to keep a lot of shield up, or if you've got like Force Armor, so you've got a high max shield, then you're probably going to be running it alongside other shield cards. But if your primary plan is like you're playing Merly and your plan is to evade most hits, or you're playing Rowden and your plan is to freeze most enemies, then Aura of Protection is probably all you need in terms of shielding, because it will provide that little bit of extra buffer in case you fail at freezing or you don't evade a hit or whatever. And it's there is the very real downside that it will take away your mana, but in general, I tend to find that the incredible value it provides outweighs that downside. Bag of Tools. I put Bag of Tools in Incredible, although it's probably towards the back because it's unreliable. Bag of Tools can be mana, it can be extra cards, it can be debuffs. It's very rare for it to not do something useful for you. And so, although I wouldn't put it on at the same level quite as some of the other ones we'll talk about later, I still tend to think that being able to reach into your Bag of Tools once per fight with any character, especially Inna who can save them, but with any character, is incredibly powerful. Battery Pack. Battery Pack is energy gain plus 20%. It's kind of, I think niche is probably the best place to put it. Basically, if you see Battery Pack in Area 1, it tends to be a pretty good pickup, because if it's against items that are only in like the good or mediocre tier, or that are like outfits or weapons that, and you already have a spot, you either don't want to, you already have that spot filled. But you take Battery Pack early because you may as well, and then it will just sit there and make it easier for you to get other items. And then later in a run, you will replace it with just another trinket that actually does something for you. So it does okay work, but you're not going to prioritize it as the most important thing. Blood Charm is an active trinket that gives you powerful 3 this turn. I say Blood Charm is great. Blood Charm is particularly valuable in any deck that tends to have big turns. So if you are, it combines well with other active trinkets. If you're playing to blow a bunch of card draw and mana, trinkets, and whatever, all your active trinkets in one turn, then combining that with Blood Charm can get you a lot of value. It also is great if you have effects like Empower or Strenuous Vigor that increase your the rank of your buffs, because you can always get this temporary powerful the same turn that you get your Empower, and ensure that you will always get exactly, you will get a permanent rank of powerful from that interaction, which can be nice if you need a way to kickstart that if you don't have other ways to get powerful. It isn't as good if you are playing a slower deck where you are less likely to have a single turn where getting the 3 powerful is directly valuable, and it tends to be at its best in decks like All-In Katon that are planning to always win on turn 1 in as many fights as possible, because if you can always just say, okay, the fight started, I'm immediately popping Blood Charm, that makes it a lot easier to get maximum value out of it, because you don't have to worry that, oh, I only realized midway through the turn that I should have used this at the beginning of the turn, which is something I do a decent amount. Cleansing Jar. Cleansing Jar reduces the rank of your debuffs by 1. I'd say this is pretty mediocre. The reason why is that although Cleansing debuffs is a powerful effect, it tends to be an effect that you want multiple times per fight, and reducing the rank by just 1 is only valuable in very specific scenarios, and tends to be not the most useful thing in those scenarios. So, especially if you already are expecting to have Cleansing Shield or Dispel Magic, the value of the jar goes down a decent amount. So, I'm not the biggest fan of it. Again, I don't think it's bad, or I don't think it's the worst thing ever. I just don't tend to find that it is a thing that I want in a lot of my runs as a priority, and a lot of fights it will not do anything for you. Cleansing Pearl is the same, but more so. Again, this is another one that suffers from the fact that in Area 3, there are just not really many elemental enemies. There's like the Vest. I think there's an enemy in there that does Arcane. I think one of the mid-bosses does Arcane, technically. Oh no, it's the Shadowbone Protectors do Arcane. But they tend to do enough Arcane that this isn't likely to actually block an activation. And the Martial Elementals do Frost, but usually you're better off tripping the Frost yourself by just playing the shields they give you. I just find that getting any value out of Cleansing Pearl can be tricky. And even when you do get value, it tends to be relatively marginal, because sort of by definition, you're not fully stopping a proc. You are just reducing the time until the next one. So I would say this is worse than the Cleansing Jar in general, although obviously like you can't cleanse off Shocked, and you can't cleanse off an Arcane Detonation, but this tends to be more valuable against more things, I think. And I still don't think this is that valuable. Cryogenic Jar, or Cryogenic Flask. Cryogenic Flask gives Froze 1 to any enemy. I'd say this is great. This is a get out of jail free for 1 turn effect. It is particularly valuable actually if you are already freezing things, because one of the neat interactions with it is if the enemy is, so when you play Cryogenic Flask, it will automatically fill the enemy to their max frost, their current max frost, whatever that is. However, if they are already at or above their max frost, it just gives them 1 more stack of frozen, which means they'll be frozen for an extra turn without increasing their maximum frost. So like normally a normal enemy would go from 10 to 15. If you freeze that normal enemy and then you use Flask, they'll be frozen for 2 turns, and then for that 3rd turn, now that they're unfrozen, you'll only need to get them to 15 frost in order to freeze them again, which is much easier than having to do 10, 15, and then 20. You save 20 whole frost over the course of those 3 turns if you want to keep that same enemy frozen for 3 turns. And that, of course, is even more, you save even more frost against bosses that way. And if you have the Doubling Spyglass, which we'll talk about later, this is one of many, 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 many ways to get a lot of extra value from Doubling Spyglass, because then you can freeze things for 2 turns without upping their max frost. Cursed Horseshoe. In game, this is called Weak Horseshoe right now because it is a find and replace error. It gives you Arcane League 1 and then draws you 3 cards. So this isn't great, and I'll put it at the front of great. And the only reason it's not incredible is that it does have a very slight downside, which is that for you to get maximum value out of this, you really do want to have some way to cleanse it, to cleanse off the arcane leak, or you have to have purity when you play it, but that is a fairly low bar. So in the vast majority of runs, Cursed Horseshoe is going to be great. And honestly, I found that even if you do not have a way to cleanse it off, if you're playing against any enemy that isn't applying Arcane, if you're not applying Arcane to yourself, and if you're not playing Gambler's Focus, you're generally fine to just play it, and as long as you play fewer than 10 cards, you won't actually pop an Arcane detonation on yourself. And as long as you're not doing that, you're fine. Because if you don't have an Arcane detonation on yourself, and you're not applying Arcane to yourself anyway, and you're in Area 3, so there's not anything really applying Arcane to you, even in Area 2, a lot of the fights, then the Arcane will slowly decay over the rest of the fight, but it won't have mattered anyway. So it's possible that this actually goes... It's possible those are, given that those caveats are relatively small, it may actually belong up in Incredible, because drawing 3 is amazing. Dancing Blade, I would put in good. It is another active trinket. It deals 1x5 damage. But that tends to be, because it's only 1x5, percentage boosts don't do much for it, so you basically need powerful working with it. If you do have powerful, it can be pretty good, or if you've got rune effects or whatever. But it does need a decent amount of support in order to really shine. And unlike a lot of the trinkets that I would put in Great or Incredible, it tends to be more of a thing that can do good work when your deck is already functioning well, rather than something that will help push your deck up further or help you really win fights you otherwise wouldn't have. It just kind of will sometimes save you a turn on winning fights that you were already probably going to win. Deadly Stinger. So Deadly Stinger, I'd put in mediocre, probably a little bit ahead of these two. So it gives Frail 2 and Bleed 10 to any enemy. The Frail is useful in some scenarios, and the Bleed 10 is basically 10 damage, but it's 10 delayed damage, which is kind of underwhelming. And like I said, Frail 2 against a lot of enemies doesn't do that much. So overall, I'd say this is a pretty early on, it can be great, or early on it can at least be more useful because that 10 damage will matter. But as you get into Area 2 and especially Area 3, that 10 damage just doesn't do much. It has some niche use in cleaning off purity on like Shadowbone Protector or Baelator. It'll help clean because it applies to debuffs, but that's still just not enough for me to rank it that high. And unlike the Dancing Blade, which I put in good, even though Dancing Blade only does 5 damage up front, the fact that Dancing Blade synergizes with more things is very useful, because Dancing Blade will synergize if you have any powerful, if you have any rune effects. Dancing Blade will do very good work, whereas there's not a whole lot you can do to make Deadly Stinger more exciting. Doubling Spyglass goes at the front of Incredible. Doubling Spyglass is busted. Doubling Spyglass does unfair things. Doubling Spyglass combos with almost every skill in the game. It's good with Empower, it's good with card draw, it's good with shield. Sometimes you'll need to use it with shield, although you're never really happy about it. It's good with Power Surge, it's good with, like I said, it's good with other trinkets. It can be good with Blood Charm to give you 6 powerful this turn. It's good with Cryogenic Flask to free something for 2 turns. It's good with Bag of Tools to get 6 tools. It's good with Cursed Horseshoe to draw 6 cards. You will be Arcane Link too, so you won't have Purity to block that. But you know, if you can get that Purity again, like even if you get Purity 1, you'll have drawn 6 cards. Then you can usually find some way to deal with the other Arcane Link. Yeah, Doubling Spyglass is ridiculous busted, and it has been, and it will continue to be. It's crazy. It's great. I love it. Duplication Tome is just as good or better. Which one of these two you want more depends a lot on the deck. Sometimes Duplication Tome, because Duplication Tome creates a temporary copy of the next of 2 non-mana cards in your hand. So if you have non-skills you want to copy, you need Duplication Tome. But you do have to pay mana for the copies that it creates, so sometimes that can be awkward. But also, if you use it to copy like Card Draw or Mana Surge, which would let you draw more mana, or if you use it to copy the mana potion, I think it's called, that is a tool that is generated, that can be generated by Inna or by this bag of tools. Because it's technically a tool, you can copy with duplication tome. Or if you have, again from the tools, if you have the Inkwell and Quill, which lets you copy another card in your hand, you copy that and you use the Inkwell to copy a mana, and that works out. Or if you use it to copy any number of other things, it can copy like Elemental Strike to give you an additional turn of all the runes on. You can use it to copy Empower to give extra, even more ranks to all your stuff. You can use it to copy Power Surge, and then when you use it on Power Surge, you'll get that extra powerful, and then because it's a temporary copy, it'll transform into the exhaustion, but it won't matter because it's going to stop existing because it's a temporary copy. Duplication Tome is amazing. I love it. It's great. It's better than great. It's incredible. It does everything. Enchanted Hammer. It upgrades card this combat and you lose all shield. I want to like it. I tend to find that it's a bit worse than I always think it will be. Partially because I just forget to use it. Partially because losing all your shield is quite a downside a lot of the time. It makes it awkward to use on turn 1. Because often you are kind of relying on that on your max shield to blunt that first attack. You can play, because I tend to play around the assumption that if I do not play any defensive cards on turn 1, everything's going to work out fine because my max shield will eat the first hit, which is a surprisingly solid assumption as long as you don't remove all your shield with Enchanted Hammer. So, Enchanted Hammer, though, can be... The other part of Enchanted Hammer is you usually will have upgraded your best cards already using normal upgrades, which reduces the value of this somewhat. I do still like it. I just tend to find that it never does as much as I'm hoping it will. Enchanted Stopwatch is in a similar spot. I would put it in good. It says every 3 offensive cards will be a critical hit. The reason that I don't put this higher is that it is... The more if you have other ways to get critical hits, the value of it goes down a lot. And if you're in the sort of deck that would tend to want this, you're usually also in the sort of deck that can either apply ambushed and gain critical, or if you're playing Merle, you can get hidden. And there's just a lot of ways to already get either a very good crit chance or even 100% crit chance. And if you're already getting to 100% crit naturally, which again isn't that difficult, then obviously you're not getting any value out of the Enchanted Stopwatch. But if you aren't in that position yet, it can do a lot of work. It is 50% damage, plus 50% damage for every 3 cards played. You do have to keep track of that yourself, but, you know, it is still useful sometimes. I would put the Frost Amulet in mediocre. And I put it at the very back. I think Frost Amulet is one of the worst trinkets in the game right now because Max Frost is just not a thing that is relevant. There are only a handful of fights in the entire game that have freezing enemies. And in a lot of them, the only one where I would put this as a particularly valuable pickup is against Frost Gorgons, which is an elite in Area 2 that may or may not even spawn for you. Because if you're fighting against the Marsh Elementals, all the way that you get Frost there is from playing the shields, which you can control when you freeze yourself with it. And if you're fighting a Frost Elemental in Area 1, you take advantage of the Elemental's Arcane Barrier to control your own Frost to freeze yourself intentionally. And in both of those scenarios, like, I don't tend to value Max Frost that much. So I would put this as being incredibly mediocre. It does stone nothing in the vast majority of fights. And the fights where it does something, it doesn't do that much. Hexing Claw. So Hexing Claw increases the rank of any enemy debuffs by 1. I would also put this in mediocre. I'd put it probably closer to the front. It is specifically useful with Shocked. But outside of that, even if you're using it to get like +1 Curse and +1 Shocked, that's pretty niche. And if you aren't getting that much value out of it, you know, like +1 turn of Vulnerable tends to be pretty +1 turn of Ambushed is whatever. +1 Poison is like 1 or 2 extra damage depending on whether or not it hit a breakpoint on rounding. You know, +1 Bleed is literally +1 damage. So a lot of times this will only be a relatively small amount of overall benefit. and you have to jump through hoops to get that benefit at all. So I'm not a big fan of Hex and Claw. I think it's pretty bad. I think it's better than Cleansing Jar because you can better actively plan around it. But it used to be pretty good. It used to be, I would have put it in Niche when it worked with Frozen. But increasing Frozen was way too strong of an interaction and needed to be nerfed. And I do not blame the dev for deciding to get rid of that. But it does mean that this is no longer particularly valuable in my opinion. Instant Accelerator. Triggers the increased effect of all cards in your hand. This is in Niche for probably obvious reasons, which is that if you don't have any increased cards, it does literal nothing. If you do have increased cards, it can be pretty good, especially if you've got increased cards. So increased cards in this case are cards like increasing mana or escalating onslaught, where they say do something and then increase this value by blank, either when you play it or when you meet another condition. Like Malevolent Idol increases its total number by whenever it's in your hand at end of turn, and then this will still work with that. So I tend to... So increasing Accelerator, you'll kind of know if it's going to be useful to you if you don't have enough increasing cards, or if the increasing cards you have don't do that much for you, or like increasing them once isn't that appealing, then obviously you don't want this. But you'll know if you want it. Key of Wisdom. Key of Wisdom is starting wits +2, starting growth +2. Again, this kind of goes to the front of mediocre. It draws you 2 extra cards. The extra growth is, and it starts with, because you start with the growth, you will get 1 extra starting mana on your first turn, because it sort of ups your maximum mana in that way. It's fine. You're not ever very excited to see this, and it's whatever. It maybe is the back of good. The fact that it does draw you a card on turn 1 and turn 2 is fine. It gives you like 1 extra mana to work with. I think I would take it more than I would take like Hex and Claw, where I like would specifically need a reason for Hex and Claw. I would put, I think, Ancient Statue above Hex and Claw, because this doesn't require you to jump through any hoops to get value out of it. But it's still pretty marginal. I would put this kind of on the borderline between these two. I'm not very excited to have a Key of Wisdom, but I'm not sad. Lucky Die would put in great. Lucky Die is active, discard 3, draw 4. Basically, any trinket that can draw me cards is good, although Lucky Die functionally only it puts you up 1 card. So it is most useful if your deck has ways to generate cards that are lower value. So like if you're playing an Inna deck, being able to trash tools you don't need right now is very good. Or if you have any shrivels, then like if you're playing like Depraved Designs Plus, or you've got the, I don't remember the name, but the 0 cost to draw 2, add 2 shrivels to the top of your deck, you can plan on just, on the first turn after you draw those shrivels, you just activate the die, pitch the shrivels, draw some cards for free. It's pretty nice. But it is definitely one of the weaker of the card draw trinkets, both because you only end up with 1 extra card total, and because you have to have the 3 cards to discard. So if you realize too late in a turn that you're going to need to keep drawing, that you have fizzled and you need to draw more cards to keep going, you either will have to discard cards that you may not want to discard, or you may not be able to use it at all. Magic Plate. Magic Plate is plated 1 at the start of every fight. It is starting plate rank 1. I put this at the front of Great, and the reason why is because I think Empower tends to be pretty good. And Magic Plate is one of the only ways to get a permanent stack of plated. There are some monster cards that will do it, but if you don't roll specifically those monster cards, you will need Magic Plate in order to get your plated going, or you'll need temporary plated, which can be awkward to line up with Empower. So that makes this a pretty useful pickup for those reasons. It also just reduces the damage and stats you take from all things by 1, which the status is particularly relevant because there are a lot of monsters, especially early on, that, for example, Lightning Elemental will specifically hit you for 10 shock which means that if you have on its first turn, which means you have a magic plate, now it's not you won't be shocked on turn one because you have just outright you have blocked one shock, which is enough to stop you from getting shocked. Because it takes from 10 to 9. So yeah, I tend to think magic plate is pretty great. It does go down in value a decent amount if you don't have Empower and you're not planning to take an Empower. But once you have this, it makes Empower a much higher value pickup. Or also if you're a more aggressive deck that just doesn't care about blocking. So maybe let's move it down a little bit. I think I still like it more than Lucky Die, but it's kind of a toss-up whether I like this or Lucky Die more. I still think it's great. I will take it over these a lot of the time, but it isn't necessarily a slam dunk. If you are not doing anything else with it, if it is just plated 1, then it definitely is on the lower end of great. So Mana Crystal, active, gain 5 mana. I think I put this at the front of great. I don't think it quite makes it into incredible because it doesn't draw you any cards, but being able to get plus 5 mana once per fight is incredibly good to just have as a thing that you can do. Feel like I don't really need to explain why having a extra 5 mana when you need it is very helpful. Mendbot. Mendbot is plus 5 health restored after combat, and this applies after your recovery cap. You will just get 5 extra health. This can be pretty good. It is very useful if you are playing a deck that needs some time to come online, and it gives you a whole lot more wiggle room with flubbing some early defense. Over the course of a run, this will add up to like more than a rest worth of healing a lot of the time. So it obviously goes down in value if you've picked it up later. It does obviously nothing if you have it. If you see it in a rest right before the Area 3 boss, or if you see it in a rest and you just aren't going to take any damage, it doesn't do anything. But it can do a lot of work with helping stabilize relatively weak relatively weak runs that are kind of floundering a little bit early on. It can help keep you rolling without having to burn rests until you can finish stabilizing. Metal Rune, Might Rune, and Mind Rune. So they each give you starting rank of a thing by 5. This is Tough, which is reduce your damage. This is Mighty, which is increase your damage. Sorry, Tough is reduce the incoming damage. Mighty is increase the damage you deal, and then Adept is increase the status you deal. I would put all of these kind of here-ish in good. They're all solid for part of it is if you already have ways to get these abilities, Mighty or Adept or Tough, then having the 5 rank starting becomes less valuable, because if you're already generating it, then you don't necessarily, then having extra only helps if you have Mask of Rage, and that doesn't even do anything for the Tough. But guaranteed gaining on turn 1 is nice. You usually will know if the Adept rune is going to do anything for you. If you don't have status, then obviously it doesn't help, because you have to be able to actually have status to increase. But Adept is also a harder buff to get, because there are just fewer cards that will provide you with Adept than there are for Mighty and Tough. But all these are solid. You're usually fine having them. If you have the accessories that increase the value of, if you have, I think it's Blessed Belt is the name of the accessory that increases how much each of these do by 20%. How much Tough, Mighty, and Adept do by 20%, that becomes better. I'm usually happy to have any of these, although, like I said, I will replace them if I see these things later on. We can actually move the Mendbot over here. Pirate Hook. Pirate Hook is incredible. Pirate Hook is treasure created on kill +2. This lets you chain kills against early enemies very effectively. I know I said that like Ancient Statue wasn't that good, but the difference is Ancient Statue is only like +1 damage to whatever you're doing. The Treasure Hook, the Pirate Hook, will let you convert 2 mana into 4 cards on average. And that is a lot of extra cards to play with. That is almost a full extra hand, as though it was an extra turn. which it turns out that's a pretty good value and will let you easily chain kills into additional kills a lot of the time. Obviously, the one downside is it doesn't do anything against one enemy fights, which is particularly notable for the Area 3 final boss. Pirate Hook is in the category of trinkets that if you are holding it and you are resting right before the final boss, or you are just getting an item drop with it after you've fought the mid boss in Area 3, you probably want to get rid of it because it just won't do anything for you in the final fight, so you may as well replace it with something that will actually do something. Poison Vial. Poison Vial is niche. If you don't have so Poison Vial is give poison 16 to any enemy if it's poisoned. That is only useful if you're poisoning things. If you are poisoning things, it is like 24, 26. Sorry, trying to do mental math. 16 plus 8 plus 4, 28, 30. It is 31 total damage, not counting other damage that you may have from poison. But because it is a power of 2, I don't think it. I would have to do the math. I'm not going to do a proof in my head on exactly how much it does in each situation. But 31 damage over the course of 5 turns is pretty okay for a trinket. But you have to already be poisoning things, and you have to not be killing the thing to other damage before you play that. Before the poison damage gets a chance to spool out. So it's pretty niche. It does have the huge downside of doing absolutely nothing if you aren't poisoning enemies, which is a pretty big restriction. I don't think there are really any other trinkets that are in that same level of do actual nothing outside of the right scenario. Pure Ghost Crystal is, I think I put it at the back of Incredible. It is the reason, so it gives you starting purity rank +3, and this manages to escape. This manages to be the absolute best of these sorts of start with a buff trinkets, because purity is just incredibly valuable in Area 3 against a lot of fights, and especially against like the mid boss. If you're fighting the Vessels of Corruption, getting to block both of their opening curses is incredibly valuable. Using it against Baylater, block its curses, or Hollow Mod blocks its curses is very valuable. It makes a lot of fights in Area 3 a lot easier. And that's before you factor in the interactions it has with cards like Brainstorm or the Cursed Horseshoe, or trying to think what other ones there are. There are several others where it's like you debuff yourself but you get a bonus, and this just means that you get all upside. Pure Ghost Crystal is great. It does a lot of work in a lot of fights. I really like it. Purifying Shard, I'd put in probably niche again. If you have like Gambler's Focuses and Mystic Ritual, this again becomes a way to avoid the downsides on those. But because Area 3 has so few fights that include status, because a lot of fights with status apply enough that you don't usually care that much about the reducing at end of turn. I don't think it's amazing all the time, but if you, like I said, if you're running like Gambler's Focus or whatever, I think it tends to do a better job than Arcane Amulet does. But it is still a pretty niche edge case, hence its placement. Runic Grenade deals 3 damage to every enemy per card in your hand. Discard your hand. This goes in good. There are runs where this has done a lot of work for me, especially where I've got card draw, but I don't have mana yet. But 3 damage per card in your hand is a pretty low overall value. Usually, each card in your hand should be worth more than 3 damage if your deck is working correctly. So this is basically only useful after you've already played out everything you can, or if it is doing enough to kill everything, which can do in Area 1 sometimes, but after that, it usually won't. So there are situations where it's useful, but I tend to find it harder to get use out of this than I do other things. Blood Scroll. Blood Scroll is starting powerful rank +1. This goes below the magic plate. It is powerful tends to be more valuable than plated because dealing damage is plated helps you avoid dying, but powerful helps you kill things, and killing things means that they can't kill you back. So if you have killed an enemy, then the amount of damage it's dealing to you is reduced to 0, always, because dead enemies don't deal damage. So that is where that's why powerful I tend to rank above plated. However, powerful is a lot easier to get, and starting powerful +1, because I mentioned with Magic Plate, one of the big one of the big advantages of Magic Plate is that it lets you increase that value later. And although that's also true of Scroll of Blood, there are enough other ways to get powerful that this becomes less of a critical piece for that reason. Because if you already have other ways to get powerful, then you don't need this to start increasing it. Scroll of Recall. Scroll of Recall, if you have no mana, draw 2 and gain 4 mana. This is also incredible. You'll notice that we have a theme here where anything that lets you, basically, with a few exceptions, if it draws you cards, it's up here. This is cards and mana, which is kind of the best of both worlds. It can be, some decks you'll have an awkward time activating it, but anytime you can activate it, it's just incredible. Drawing cards, getting mana in a single trinket, that's just amazing. Shield Bot. Shield gained on health loss +3. This is incredible. This is with Aura Protection in terms of just ridiculous, incredible survivability value. Where you take this and that forgives a lot of sins as far as defense is concerned. Shield Bot can do, against enemies that are doing like 4x3, if you were going to take 4x3 damage and you had exactly 3 shield from Shield Bot triggering on the previous turn, then Shield Bot saves you 9 health for no mana against a 4x3 hit. And that there are several enemies that can do that to you. And just over the course of a run, Shield Bot can save you dozens of health. Sometimes over the course of a single fight, Shield Bot can save you a dozen or more health pretty easily. And that can take a lot of stress off your healing. It can take a lot of stress off your other defensive cards. Unlike Aura of Protection will often let you completely negate damage. Shield Bot usually won't do that. Obviously, Shield Bot can't do that because you will be taking some health damage. But Shield Bot can negate a lot of damage. And it doesn't cost any mana to do so. If you are aggressive enough that you're winning every turn, or if you already have enough defense, it loses some value, obviously. But generally speaking, if the enemies are hitting you, Shield Bot's going to do a lot of work. Shifting Feather. I'd put this one at good. It gives you a starting evasion rank +2, which if you're playing Merly especially, where you value those evades, it can help you. Even if you plan to get into Hidden, being able to guarantee those first 2 evades is very nice. If you're playing an aggressive deck that doesn't want to play many defensive cards, this will let you get away with not playing as many, because the first turn, in addition to your max shield, you'll have 2 evades to deal with initial hits, which will let you focus on dealing as much damage as possible, and you can just ignore the first turn, hopefully. So that's pretty good. Although that 2 evade, like I said, it's only 2 evasion, so it will outlive its usefulness eventually, but it's still fine. Shock Amulet. This is the shock version where you get +8 max shock. I put this in niche if you are fighting specifically Emerald Dragon at the end of Area 2, if that's your Area 2 boss, and you see this during Area 2, and you know Emerald Dragon is your boss, and you don't have another way to deal with Emerald Dragon, this can do okay. Every single other scenario, it's trash. The only fight I value this against is Emerald Dragon, and to a much lesser extent, the Chimera. And those 2 fights, there are other ways to handle them, and this does nothing besides make those 2 fights easier. Technically, it has an impact in a couple other fights, but those are the only 2 fights where I actually care. So, very niche. Snail Shell. Gain 12 shield and tough 1. This goes alongside the Shifting Feather, in that it is kind of a get out of jail free card once, but only sort of. 12 shield and tough 1 will help you against a lot of things, but it won't help you against everything. And it's only once per fight, so it will sometimes help you a lot, but it's nowhere near as valuable as like Shield Bot or Aura of protection in terms of consistency. So I think fitting it here alongside like the Shifting Feather and the Tough Rune is a decent spot for it. Spiky Warbot. Active. Gain Reflect 5 this turn. Mediocre. There are, against specifically Assault Wisps, this can do good work. Against every other fight in the game, this is not really noticeable damage. It's just not very exciting. Yeah, that's basically what I have to say about it. Like, Reflect 5, most of the time that is at most 15 damage to enemies, and they have to hit you, so if you have like any evade, this becomes worthless. Against enemies that are only hitting you once or twice, it's not very good. Against enemies that have a lot of health, it's not very good. It's just mediocre. Sticky Flask. I'd put this kind of at the back of good. It removes 10 shield and 5 evasion from any enemy, gives them vulnerable to an ambush to 2 if they had no shield. So it's worth noting, if it removes shield, even if it removes all of their shield, you don't get the vulnerable and the ambushed. So if you're keeping this, it is because the vulnerable and the ambush matters to you. You are not really taking this for the removal of shield. You're definitely not taking it for the removal of shield, because like removing 10 shield is the same as basically dealing 10 damage, which is underwhelming for an active trinket. And removing 5 evasion is only relevant against like 2 or 3 fights total. If you just need some way to deal with drakes, this is fine, but this only deals with 1 drake. So it's kind of underwhelming in that regard. So yeah, if you take this, it's because the vulnerable and the ambush matter, and that's the only reason. Tesla Coil. End of turn shock applied to a random enemy, +6. I put this at the front of good. I tend not to be the hugest fan of it, because if I'm playing shock cards, I tend to be trying to play shock cards that can get the shock on their own. And then Tesla Coil needs you to have ended your turn twice before it will shock at an enemy. And I tend to try to play in such a way that I am not ending my turn that many times against the same enemy. And the other note is, if you're fighting multiple enemies, because the shock is applied to a random enemy, if it rolls a different enemy than it rolled the first time, then you're not getting that shock until yet another turn has passed. So it can take quite a while before Tesla Coil will show any return. And depending on how much damage your hits are doing, it may only be worth 10 to 15 damage, which isn't awful, but it's not, if we're waiting 2 to 3 turns to get 10 to 15 damage, that's not the most amazing thing. It still can do enough that I'm willing to put it in front of good. I know other people have had very, very good experiences with it. I just haven't been the most impressed. Thirsty Fang. Thirsty Fang is active, deal 5 damage to any enemy. If this kills it, you gain 3 maximum health. So the maximum health is cute, but I am rarely in a position. This is partially just me speaking as somebody who is at this point very experienced with the game, but the 3 max health isn't that appealing, because that only matters if I am very endangered, and I am rarely playing runs that are so close to the wire that even 15 to 20 max health is making a difference. And 5 damage is just not much damage. So that's why it's where it is. I don't tend to think it's that useful. And actually, I think I would actually move it down to mediocre, and probably below the reflecting Warbot. Sorry, the spiky Warbot, because I just haven't been impressed with it lately at all. I rarely take it, and when I do take it, it's hard to line up, and even when I do line it up, the maximum health doesn't do much. Tiny Book. Tiny Book draws cards. Tiny Book is incredible. Being able to draw cards from scratch, very good. One of the biggest problems that aggressive decks can have, and all in K-Ton decks especially can have, is you get to the final fight and you look at your opening hand. Your opening hand has no ways to draw cards, and you thus can't get your engine rolling. Having ways to draw cards to get your engine rolling is incredibly useful. The discard one is kind of a bigger downside than the Arcane Link one, depending on what you're doing, but it doesn't require you to jump through any hoops to make it work. And if you're using it to kickstart, and you're usually fine using this earlier in a turn, if you don't have purity and you don't have cleansing, you don't really want to use this until later, and you kind of want to use your card draw as early in a turn as possible to give you as many options, so you know what options you're working with. And so for that reason, I put Tiny Book slightly above the Cursed Horseshoe, but they're both incredible. I might move these two down a little bit, depending on how much you need survivability. I tend to put the card draw above these, I think, but that's because I'm a more aggressive player. But yeah, all these are, as the tier name suggests, incredible. Burning Concoction, which is misordered for some reason. I may not have this in my notes. Apparently I don't have this on the wiki page yet. I just thought I did. So Burning Concoction, what it does is it deals 5 damage, I think, to all enemies with burn, and then it applies burn 2 to all enemies. That's mediocre. If you don't already have your enemies burned, it doesn't do anything in terms of upfront damage. Unlike Poison Vial, at least it will always apply the burn 2. But it's a relatively low amount of total damage regardless, and it's only one-time use. It's not the worst thing ever. It is technically 10 damage, but that's just not super high value. Vindictive Aura. Vindictive Aura is every time you hit for 10 or more damage, you do a hit for 10 or more damage, you heal for 2. The wording is a little bit misleading. It says healing when dealing 10 plus damage with a card. If you deal, it is 10 damage in a single hit with a card. If a card deals 10 damage multiple times, it will heal you 2 for each time it hit for that much damage. If the card hits 4 times for 4 damage each, like Aether Storm Plus, that's a total of 16 damage, but you won't get any Vindictive Aura procs because none of the hits were enough damage on their own. So, worth keeping in mind. I would put it at the front of Great. It is very good healing. It is one of those where, especially if you're playing Drophus, it's incredible. If you're in Drophus, it moves up to the Incredible tier. For other characters, I would just put it in Great. It helps you basically compensate for missing health in basically every fight that isn't like a Bailator that's just doing mountains of damage. Most decks are going to be hitting for 10 or more damage at some point in the fight, and usually will be doing it multiple times because dealing damage is how you win, and hitting for 10 or more damage is pretty important if you want to kill Area 3 enemies anytime this year. So that's where I'm at on that. The Warbot. Warbot is end of turn damage first enemy +4. This can go sit in the pool of mediocre damage effects. I don't really think I need to say much more than that. It's not much damage. It's once per turn. It's mediocre. There's a reason this isn't the bad category. None of these are useless. Except for you. You're useless. Sorry, Frost Amulet. You're the only really, really useless one here. All the others are not useless. They're just mediocre. They're disappointing. They never do as much as you want them to. Finally, Witty Charm, which is starting Wits rank +4. It's better than the Key of Wisdom because I think drawing an extra card for 4 turns is more useful than the +2 growth in most situations. I still wouldn't put it that high. I'd still put it below Minbot, I think. I'm going to put Minbot above Runic Grenade. But Witty Charm, you draw extra cards for a few turns. It obviously loses a lot of value if you're able to generate wits off of your cards. In which case, it's guaranteed to get you at least 1 extra card if it's your first source of starting wits, because there's no matter how many wits cards you have in your deck, you can't get wits before you start the first turn unless you have either Key of Wisdom or Witty Charm. But overall, pretty medium. So I do tend to value drawing cards more than I value dealing small amounts of damage. I just think that I can expect to get more out of 1 card in my deck than I can out of like Thirsty Fang or Spiky Warbot or Wurbot. So that is my tier list of how I would rank all of these trinkets. Like I said, I will post a link to the wiki, and I will post a link to this tier list in the comments.